Hi, it's Peter Boyles back with The Shoot here on 710 KNUS, and I am thrilled to have this one. I got to set this up 2 Saturday nights ago. Of course, Alan Berg is inducted into the Press Club Hall of Fame, and they had this magnificent dinner, and again, thanking Albie and all the people who did all the heavy lifting. I walked into the dinner, and it was like a high school reunion that you really wanted to go to, and one of the first people, I said, that's Jerry Bell. Jerry Bell, for 35 years, worked in Denver. He was with we made a list: Clear Channel, iHeart, Below, and J-Core. And the only way I could top that is I also added General Electric. 35 years in Denver, San Francisco, KOA Radio's man, news director, and the beat goes on.
Hey.
This is a good
And
man.
I was once your boss.
And once my boss.
And you know, before that, I had hair here.
We'll tell that story about driving off the road, but
Yeah.
I've tried to take The Shoot and make it a series of old radio hands before it gets away. And Mike Rosen sat here, Lee Larson's been here. I'm going down a list of old radio hands, and hopefully we can get Rick Lewis to do it, and Dave Logan. We've been talking about it. Kathy Walker, Carol McKinley. But you, of all people, and 35 years ago you came to Denver.
Yeah. 45 total in radio.
You were in San Fran.
Yeah.
Talk about your background, why we were lured into this business.
Well, I would say as a kid growing up, I was kind of a lost kid. But I did have the ability to write fairly well. And my mom said, well, you should pursue writing.
What did your dad do for a living?
My dad was a merchant, and he his specialty was opening stores, getting them running, and then selling them. And it mainly in furniture, paint, wallpaper, floor coverings type of stores. And he did that very successfully. We weren't super rich by any extent, but that's how he made a living. And we went to college. And
where did you live in terms of San Francisco?
I was born in Oakland, California.
Oh, wow, okay.
I lived until about 12 years old in a little town south of Oakland called San Lorenzo. Mm-hmm. My older brother Jeff, used to say this in the East Bay, used to call us, we were East Bay Grease.
Yeah.
East Bay Grease. It was mainly the neighborhood where people had jobs, where they worked in factories and things like that. Later on in life, we made the move up to Sonoma County, and that's where I really kind of, when people ask me what's my hometown, I say Santa Rosa in Sonoma County. Mm-hmm. And I went to a really great high school there, and sort of got into editing the school paper and decided I was going to become a journalist. Went to San Francisco State University, which had a really good journalism program, taught by either alcoholics or former alcoholics who were in the news business. But they taught us well, and I used the training I got there every day when I was in news. That was really good schooling. I was really fortunate. I worked an internship at a radio station into a job. So at 20 years old, I'm on the air. I'm actually not out of college yet. I'm on the air working. It was KIOI, which went by K101. It was an FM station. It was famous for having a news department, the biggest FM news department west of the Mississippi. Now that sounds really bold. It was 5 people.
Yeah, it's 5.
But I worked out of.
But you can say it because it's true.
Yeah, I worked out of San Francisco City Hall. There was a press room there, and that's where I worked. I covered the Board of Supervisors, the mayor, all that.
You covered Harvey Milk.
I covered Harvey Milk, yeah.
Take a second with people that don't know that story.
Well, it's a little bit of a complex story, but there was another supervisor. Milk was a member of the Board of Supervisors, which is like a city council. And he and this guy, Dan White, often were opposed to one another. Dan White had no doubt about it, anger issues. When he would get mad at the supervisors meeting, it would be like those cartoon characters where you suddenly flush red. Saw that many times. Dan White decides he's going to leave because he had a business on Pier 39, wasn't doing well, and he had other issues going on. And so this was great news for Mayor George Moscone because he now could appoint the swing vote on the supervisors. So White had some regrets about leaving, and he had scheduled a meeting with Moscone. Moscone had already knew what he was going to do. So the mayor brings White into the office, and there's this little room off to the side. And George Moscone was a drinker, okay? And he's pouring drinks for Dan, telling them, "Nah, you're not going to get your job back." And White pulls out his gun. Now, I left out one little part. White snuck into City Hall with the gun through a window. So, because we actually had metal detectors at the City Hall even then. So he shoots Moscone, coup de grace, shot to the head, goes across City Hall, finds Milk, shoots him. And, to be honest with you, Milk is a great man, but he also could be a little nasty, and he kind of reveled in the fact that White was going to lose his job and those kind of things, and they had a little bit of a tug of war. That said, Harvey Milk was one of the most interesting people I'd met when I was, so I'm in the business.
He's openly gay. This is
Yeah. He used to joke, the San Francisco Chronicle used to call him, they had all these euphemisms for like people or things. Avowed homosexual Harvey Milk, okay?
Sure.
And he used to joke,
the beginning of
I'm going to change my name to Avowed Homosexual.
Yeah, I read these books.
And Dianne Feinstein was Pacific Heights matron Dianne Feinstein, and things like that. So, yeah, he's openly gay, but there's the most engaging individual and the greatest off-the-cuff orator I've heard. He was amazing. So anyway, I'm still going to school. And in one of my classes, I wrote this op-ed piece. They were trying to ban Huckleberry Finn. This comes up every now and then. And I wrote this piece, and my professor, who was an editor at the Examiner, said, "I'm going to print this." So he prints it, and Harvey reads it, and I'm at, Board of Supervisors, and he motions to me. He says, "I read that." And he says, "Come into my office." And it turned out he was this huge Mark Twain fan. And so we talked, and I was too. So we talked Mark Twain, and that's how we got to know each other. So, I remember when they voted, on Amendment 6.
Sure.
Harvey had been in on LA, and I was at City Hall with the vote count. And it's like really late at night, and I'm sort of leaving finally, and he's just arriving. And I just remember this picture in my mind. He just looks at me and says, "Jerry, we did it." and that's my memory of Harvey.
The part that I remember was that bizarre defense. Wasn't it called the Twinkies?
Yeah, the Twinkie defense, yeah. We knew, Dan White had this potato stand on Pier 39. He had this horrible eating habits, and this caused him to go off and be crazy.
His defense attorney, because he was eating Twinkies, right?
Yeah, and it's, it was, so he gets more or less off on manslaughter, even though the evidence shows it pretty much deliberation. So I remember, because I'm in the courtroom there, and we all looked at each other and go, "There's going to be a riot tonight." And yes, there was. It was called the White Night Riot. Yeah. And
remember Stonewall had happened. I mean, there was a lot of things that led in.
They burned police cars. They did all these. And it was horrible. It was
in the Castro.
And they marched from the Castro to City Hall. They busted in the doors of City Hall. So I'm covering this riot, and it's late at night, and I'm dog tired, and I had this walk up. I trip on the stairs and mess up my ankle. Had to go to the hospital. So the next day I walk into the station with crutches, and they go, "What happened to you at the riot?"
Oh, you said, yeah.
I go, "Well, no, this trip." I said, "I got to come up with a better story." But that actually happened. Covered a lot of interesting things. Patty Hearst. Covered a lot with her.
What did you all do? Did you ever talk to her?
I never talked to her, but I talked to an awful lot of people.
You never talked to the SLA guys, did you?
People who harbored them, I did.
Okay, all right.
And
what's his name? The basketball player.
Well, Bill Walton through his management, and then there were some other people.
For the people,
who had the story. Anyway, there's a really good book called American Errors. It's written by Jeffrey Toobin, but I read that book, and every bit of it was me. I could read that and I go, I talked to that person, I talked to that person, I talked to this person, I talked to...
What's like being a Ramses.
Yeah, and it's just kind of like, it's a really excellent book if you want to know about the Patty Hearst story. That's what I would tell people rather than to get into a big long thing about it.
Believe it or not, I was working in the business. I'm in grad school at the time, and somebody wrote on a board in grad school, "Right on, Tanya." Now,
Do you know that the first time that live television cameras covered a story was when the SLA house was burning in Los Angeles. That was the first time that we did, it's a live coverage of anything
officers,
like that long form.
Police officers would pull up, get out of the car, just unload their guns at the house and drive away. I don't even know where she is today, what she's doing today.
Yeah, she's married to a guy who was her bodyguard,
Yeah.
and I think they live in the Northeast somewhere.
What a story that
Yeah,
was.
it was an incredible story. There were lots of stories and characters. The station I worked at was owned by a gay man, and we had about half of our staff were gay and lesbian, and through the AIDS crisis, we lost a lot of them. Covered that. One of my personal heroes is a guy named Dr. Mervyn Silverman.
Yeah, sure.
He was the guy who padlocked the bathhouses in San
And they didn't
Francisco,
want that
and
to
they
happen.
ran him out of
Oh,
town.
I know.
Great hero.
There's a book entitled "And the Band Played
Yes,
On."
Randy Schultz wrote that book, and I knew Randy.
I knew Randy.
Yeah, and he
Randy-
ironically died from AIDS.
And he was dying of AIDS,
Yeah.
but he never let it on. But that's an important book.
Yeah, it's an excellent, and it's right on the money of what was happening there.
Because gay men principally had just come out. There was Stonewall. There was.
Hey, they had all of a sudden you had freedom, and it was like crazy. They were, as one counsel or a supervisor who was gay who took over for Harvey, a guy named Harry Britt, used to say, we were screwing like jackrabbits.
Yeah. And when the doctor, who was a public health guy, right?
Yeah.
Closed him. That's in Randy's book.
Yeah.
And he shut down locked him.
Yeah,
And
padlocked.
And it's much like kind of what we watched a little bit with COVID.
He saved thousands of lives.
Absolutely.
I mean, literally, if you were in San Francisco at that time, it was nothing but funeral after funeral after funeral.
And it was a mystery.
And it was well, it wasn't so much of a mystery as it was happening, but there was this level of, and what that book is about, the level of denial, because who wants to give up this newfound freedom? We're going to deny that this is happening, and
One of the
it's
more
happening.
interesting people in that book was Nancy Reagan,
Yeah.
who said, because she came out of Hollywood and had tons of friends, and he talks about her in this. All right, so who brought you here?
Well, this is kind of an interesting story because you know how now we have all these Californians coming to Denver?
Yeah.
Well, guess what? Back then on a radio salary, if you wanted to survive and live, and I was actually one of the higher paid people at the station I was at, I got married and I wanted a house, and I was looking at 3 hours of commuting every day. And I said, screw this. I'm not,
Each way.
well, not each way, one and a half. But it's like, I don't want to do this. And I had been living in the city, and that. So, and my wife was from Denver. I had been to Denver, and she got a PhD in political science, and we were looking for places to live. And she was looking at different professorships and things. And finally, we just came upon going, well, let's just go to Denver. So we moved without jobs to Denver. And my first job, actually, I should have told you, this was at the old Kim radio, KYGO.
95 Kim.
KYGO. I did the newscast on KYGO for a little while. But I could see that the Kim radio part of it was going to go away because I had seen something similar happen in San Francisco. So I was desperate. And I wanted
At
to
one
get
time, that's a monster station.
yeah, it was monsters, but and I'm working with like some really talented people there.
Who was there at the time?
Steve Alexander, Scott Cordeleau, George Weber.
There's a story.
Phil Boyce was the news director.
He's our boss now at Salem.
Yeah, these are really, really great people, but the top 40 genre was disappearing, and it was very similar to a station in San Francisco called KFRC, which the same thing happened to. Had a strong news department, and then it just went away. So I wanted to get out. I wanted to go to a station where news was important because I'm a news guy, and KOA was it. There was an opening that came up. It happened to be that somebody I knew the person who was leaving, and what they would be looking for So I interviewed with Chris Ollinger.
There you go.
And
Who I want to do the show.
and I told her what I think she wanted to hear, and I got the job.
And she was one of the first women executives in the music business, in the radio business.
Yeah.
Probably here in town. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know who else was a predicator for her, and KO knew the business too.
Yeah, she was great,
She did.
and always looked after me
I
for
didn't know
many years.
I didn't know that KO hired you.
Yeah.
Who was running the show?
That's a good question, and I don't know if I remember who.
Was it Lee?
Yeah, Lee was there.
Okay.
Yeah, Lee came because, yeah, Lee was there, and I know I've watched some of the other ones of these that you've done, and we all have the same opinion. Lee Larson, greatest general manager of radio ever. And
he was there Saturday night when Alan was inducted.
Yeah, what he taught me more than anything as a manager was how you build a team of people and how you work them and get the best out of them. And the level of communication that we had as a management team was great. We met every week. And then we also had a programming meeting every week. We were looking ahead. What happened to promotion? We would be looking ahead and always from a radio point of view looking at it as how are we going to own this? How are we going to own it on the air, on the sales, promotions? How are we going to own that? And we were really successful at it. And we were also good at celebrating our victories, which is another thing I think is really good.
So who's the PD?
I'm
trying to remember.
Well, for a little while it was Tracy Pratt.
That's another.
We won't go there.
No, we stay away from that.
But before that, I forget who it was. It's 35 years ago.
But
Pete.
how many people were in the news department then?
Oh gosh, a lot more
Than now.
I mean, we had an assignment editor. We had somebody. Well, we had somebody doing business. We had 3 or 4 or 5 reporters out on the street. We had a lot of resource in there. A helicopter that we exclusively owned and operated for traffic. So yeah, there was a lot of investment.
Was Art
in that.
Newman? I'm trying to remember.
No,
Because I stole traffic reports from Dick Dillon, from
it was John Hartley when
There you go.
And one thing I remember about that helicopter when there was a big, huge tornado in Lyman at night, nobody could get any information. We put the helicopter up and sent it out there. John was able to put the lights on and look at the damage, and then you get up high and shoot a signal back. And so like the emergency services people for the state were listening to him because they had no eyes on it. And that was the only way we did that. So really great example of how, and I really think it was Chris who really pushed that to make that happen. And we, nobody could compete with it. And
She was,
so
she
it was
was
really good.
That team, because
It was a good team. Even sales. Dick Carlson was our sales manager.
Love Dick.
And, Dick, the creativity level of how they put things together was amazing. We used to do like these Bronco highlight tapes. We sold at King Supers.
Oh,
and
man.
a lot of times it saved our bacon at the end of the
They
year.
had game day.
Yeah, and game day. And we owned a lot of the advertising stuff in stadium at that time before. And so it was very lucrative.
And that was Lee.
Yeah.
That was Lee Larson, John Beek.
Yeah.
So when you came here, so you're just reading the news, and then they gave you and you were just elevated.
No, I came here and I started as I would come in at 2 o'clock in the afternoon and leave at 10 at night. So between 2 in the afternoon, I would report, and then I'd anchor, and then I'd record casts that would run overnight. I remember it. The thing I remember most about it was we had this news booth with this very old audio board, like it had tubes in it.
Where was the radio station located?
That was on Lawrence Street. It was on Lawrence Street.
Okay.
And high rise. Yeah. But this board was old, and sometimes when you're doing newscasts, it would smoke a little bit. But across the glass, we had engineers, and they were still unionized. And I remember this one guy. He would sit there.
Use a first name.
Benny.
Okay, I know who you're talking about.
He'd sit there with the cigarette with an ash about this long, and he'd be looking at you, and we had to cue them to play the audio in the newscast. So the first one I do, I go like this, and Benny goes like that. Okay, so then I learned that I had to do the cue a few seconds before I wanted the audio. But that was it, and then we were sold to J-Corps. They came in, they bought all those guys out, and that was the end of union. The news department was also somewhat unionized. I never joined, and it went away.
And I'm a pro-union guy, and they came to me, and I had experiences with a couple of those, union, and I'm pro-union.
Yeah, I am too.
But what am I getting here? And
it used to be the insurance policy that AFTRA had, which was great, and that's why all the car dealers did their own spots, because they could become AFTRA members.
We did those spots in the old Channel 2 building, factory outlet and all this stuff. But I remember when that went free fall or free form, and it just opened up, and people went, "Oh, really?" And that's when I met Benny Marufo and all those guys who came in, and they were.
You just outed Benny now.
God, I love Benny. Man.
He's probably long gone.
He passed away. Yeah, Benny's gone, but
he was a nice guy.
Great guy.
Don't get me wrong, but
Benny was a retired gunnery sergeant from the Marine Corps.
Yeah,
and nobody knew it. And Benny was about this tough.
Yeah,
and he was, and probably the two, because the non-sports guys, Gus Marcus.
Oh, Gus, yes,
would get his hands up like that. Benny was tough. Benny would get his hands up, and there was a handful of guys in that building that. And now I say, guys like Dave Logan, those guys. Well, I might just leave them alone. But that was a different time, and things were settled differently.
Yeah, I think so.
They really were.
But you bring up Gus, and when I first came to Denver, I go, who is this guy, Gus Marcus? He's on the air, and he's like everything that your morning person is not supposed to be. He's grumpy, he's all this kind of stuff.
Had a voice of an angel. He was
and he had a great voice. But if you went to Gus, and you know this, you go, "Hey, Gus, how you doing?"
I know the answer.
You know what the answer? Shitty. Right? So I'm at this broadcasting convention, and there's this weather booth, and these guys have these T-shirts, and it's a map of the United States, and with clouds and stuff. Except that it doesn't say, cloudy, it just says shitty. And so I bought this T-shirt for Gus.
I loved him. He was one of my early mentors, and he had a hard nose, man. He really did.
He was a little marshmallow inside, though.
And that was the part of it. And I always said, we're going to have a conversation. I don't know, somebody, and by the way, Sandy Clough sat where you are, and Sandy was telling same kinds of stories about Gus. We told Gus stories, and he said the first time we ever read sports for Gus, and he went like a minute 30 over. Yeah. And Gus pulls him aside and said, "Do it again." Anyway, but that was.
Yeah. I knew a program director when I was in San Francisco who brought a guy in to his office and put a pickle on the table.
Do it again.
And he said, if you do that again, and he takes a knife and he slaps the pickle. No, you could not do that today. That's
Gus was kind of when I was jocking at Cat Radio and it was MRI, and so this is so Gus, who, I adored him. Gus takes me up to Colfax to some little, one of those spoon restaurants up there, and we're sitting talking. I just, he was words of wisdom. He said, this was like 1st of December or something. And he said, "Do you ever notice," he said, "when you turn the radio on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, there's somebody there?" And I went, "Well, yeah." And he said, "They're sure it's you." and I just worked, the whole, but you needed the money. And
still today.
Yeah, of course.
I used to work Christmas all the time. And Thanksgiving.
That was always the thing about the managers that really understood. They gave the guy the day off, and then they'd, like you did, and then they'd sit and fill in. There was just so many. That was such a powerhouse, and because in that building was KHOW radio, KOA radio, 760. The floor below it, 103.5 The Fox with Lewis and Floor Wax, KBCO, they had made a mistake and brought them out of Boulder, which was really a mistake. Who else was down there? Willie B was there. Willie B was there.
One of the smartest guys in the building.
Oh, just a great
I
guy.
love Willie B.
I want to get Willie to sit here and talk.
Yeah, he'd be great.
Yeah. And so were there how many stations were in that cluster?
8. And it's actually 9 now because they moved. BPI is internet driven. But and then broadcast in some other locales. I don't know what they're doing now. It's been a year. I'm almost a year gone from the place. But the expansion of radio like that was both a blessing and a curse, because you got a radio station in the building, and not all of them can be number one, right? No. So who gets?
And there were ones they wanted to be number one.
Yeah, there were ones that they did, and they got certain resources the others didn't. Yeah. How you packaged them together, how you complemented them together. A lot of times, I used to have this one where I would feel like, because KOA was this big powerhouse. It had sports, it had news, and it had talk. And then all of a sudden, and traffic. And then all of a sudden, traffic's on all the other 8 stations. And all of a sudden, I always felt like they were taking pieces of KOA to build the other ones. That's because I was on KOA. For the other guys, it was good. So I'm not complaining. I'm just saying that's kind of things you look at it and go
that's what made Larson so brilliant.
Yeah.
As I don't say anybody could have programmed KOA because it was this fast ship that. But
I did it for a couple of years, and let me tell you, it was two of the hardest years of my life.
Had to.
It's a big. It was like the proverbial, can't turn the battleship to do anything. It's so big.
But then Lee has all these other.
Yeah.
He's got he's sitting there with a baseball bat, power saw, and a bowling ball, and he's trying to keep it all in the air. But boy, that had to be hard.
But you also, about Lee is he knew that even when his busiest times and when he had a lot of stuff to do, you got to walk the floor. You got to be connected to your people, and he did a good job of that. And I never forgot that. And even when I was programming, and actually at one time my office was on one floor, but all my people were on another. I had to get out of my chair and go and just walk.
What was the biggest conflict you think you were in during that time?
What do you mean by conflict?
You pick.
Well, it's sometimes you have. I think the biggest ones you have are, if you're a programmer, you're always have a little bit of tension between you and the sales department. Although you can really work with people and do some amazing things with the salespeople, but occasionally you get somebody in sales who was overly aggressive and sold something that really crossed ethical lines, and you get a yelling, screaming match about it. I won't name names, but you know who I'm talking about.
Boy, do I.
But it's all.
That's when the guy comes in and said, "You're going to be there on Friday night." You're going to do it.
But those are actually the good ones in sales. The ones that are super aggressive and are trying to work for their clients and who are successful at it. So you have your thing, and then it's over, and you go on, and you're friends and stuff. But I think the hardest thing sometimes is just to coordinate everybody, or when I want something to complement something, and saying, can you find a client that fit this? Running into resistance, because for a long, long time, and I'm overstating this, okay, but a lot of the KOA salespeople, the station was doing so well, they could just take the phone calls.
Just answer the phone.
Right?
That's
and
right.
so
That's right.
to get them up to do something unique was very difficult. When I did KHOW, I had a great sales department that would work with me, and we did some really fun stuff, events and things like that. It all comes with the territory.
How much of it still stays today?
What do you mean? How much?
How much is
none?
No.
I think it does. I think it's a different world now. No matter what company you work for in radio, the large companies, things are tight. I equate it to this: look at what happened with radio. is kind of an after what happened to newspapers. Newspapers lost classified ads, the Craigslist, and it killed a lot of newspapers. It was a huge profit center. Now radio is competing with streaming, your phone. We're both sitting here looking at our phones. So the landscape has changed. So making money, you don't call it commercial radio for nothing, is a lot more difficult. And so what happens is, I think, is you get this squeeze, and eventually that squeeze, like the Denver Post is a good example. Great paper for me at one time. Now it's, the people who are running it are trying to keep it alive, and they're doing a fairly decent job of it. But I don't need it.
Yeah.
There's nothing there for me that I can't get anywhere else. And that's the same thing now with radio. I can get it 100 other different places.
About, I don't know, 15 years ago, 17 years ago, we always got interns and summer guys, and they wanted to hang with you, and they were going to J schools and
sure.
And I'm trying to remember this young man's name. It'll come to me. And I said, I got in early, and interns get in early. And we went on the air at 5, and I think this was like 3:45 in the morning. And I remember we got the newspapers.
Right.
This young man comes in to the radio station. I'm sitting there, I'm looking, and he drops. It was like USA Today, the Journal, I don't know, I forget, Post News. Boom, drops him. He goes, "Hey, Peter, yesterday's news just got here."
Yeah.
It's a true story.
Yeah, well, that's true.
Oh, it really is true.
Yeah. It's one of the reasons why I think on radio still news does really well in the morning, is because it can be fresh, and there is stuff that happened overnight. But people are bombarded with information, bombarded with a lot of bad information, and it's a struggle. And I also believe this thing I always believed was unique content is what wins. But when you start squeezing down the shaft, your ability to produce that unique content ends. And then you just have what everybody else has.
Oh yeah. I mean, so in that heyday of KOA radio, and that was called Half a Round Table, and I worked in that studio, and then we worked what they called the other one up there, the little small studio, but the big one that was as big as this room, was half a round table.
Yeah.
Gus sat in the center.
Right.
The engineer was up in a booth looking down.
Yeah.
All right, now, how many people did that show? I mean, KO, I know, was on there. I'm thinking Kent was there, Gus, obviously.
Yeah.
Lori was there. I mean, you get on a list. I must have been 15 to 18 people to put that show on the air.
Oh yeah, and behind the scenes, you've got a news editor that's writing the material, and of course you had morning reporter that was out and about, traffic, weather, business.
Yeah.
All those things had
Farm and Ranch.
Yeah, well, Farm and Ranch kind of went. This is the interim. Farm and Ranch went away because farmers, guess what? They got computers. They didn't need that anymore.
No.
So you were providing a service that wasn't needed anymore.
But he was there. I mean, he had Farm and Ranch report.
Yeah. Well, we had it for a few years when I got there.
I worked with him
and we did do that. Yeah, and
So
it changes. Everything changes. Everything evolves in a certain way. It just does. But definitely, technology and changing ways to get information has impacted radio, and it's impacted television. When you watch TV, you watch a newscast, and you see 2 promos in the break. At least one of those is an ad space that was sold.
That's precisely what it is.
That's what you have to look at.
When we hear PSAs now, public service announcements, we always trying to make those play on Sunday night.
Yeah, right.
No, because you can't make any money on it.
Yeah.
And they're going, well, nobody's listening. We'll jam them in there now.
Yeah.
And there was also the required, to do public service, and that's out the window. And that's but
there's a few companies that, like Bonneville, which do public service stuff still to this day, and they do a really good job of it, and they becoming. That's another thing I think. Being part of your community is so key, and we're losing some of that as we cut back and don't do things that we used to do.
Roughest moment on the job.
I think announcing deaths of personnel. Like Gus, being the guy that had to do that.
Yeah. Did you do that one?
I did.
It was a funeral.
Yeah, and I did the obit piece on Gus.
Yeah.
Those are some tough ones that you do when you. I think that's the roughest thing. I never really felt it was rough. I loved what I was doing, and had tried to have a good time doing it, and have as much fun as we could have doing it.
What called the end? I mean, you have been shot through the greases, we used to say.
Yeah. Well, 45 years in radio, I've kind of seen it and done it. So I was, I wasn't thinking, I thought maybe I would retire around the age, I'm going to be 67 next month. That was kind of maybe what I was going to do. And, but as things kind of got cut back and I found myself, I'm a reporter at heart. I like to get outside of the confines of the station. And I was finding that harder and harder to do. And so it was less fun for me. And also less ability to do longer form pieces, which I like to do with sound and use the medium. So that was kind of part of it. I just was tired. And COVID was going on there. I was working. I was one of the few people working at the station during COVID. Maybe we were like 5 people there, and it was tough. It was a tough time. And then I had a foot surgery that went bad, and I got a blood clot.
You told me the story. This is insane.
I had a blood clot as a result of this foot surgery.
Had you already retired, or were you still on the job?
I was still on the job. I wasn't going to retire until the end of that year. I had already decided I was going to retire when this happened. I was looking ahead to summer. I'm a cyclist. I wanted to get on my bike and really lose the COVID-19 that I put on, and that was my goal. And I had this issue with my foot. So I had the surgery, and 3 or 4 days later, it seemed like, I can't remember exact timeline, I'm getting up early in the morning because Vicki, my partner, has to get up because she's producing a live shot for the Today Show. And so it's 3 o'clock in the morning, she's up, and I'm waking up, and I'm going, my foot is just killing me. I can't walk on it. I think it's infected. That's what I thought, it was infected. And I said, I got to go back to the hospital. And she says, well, I can't take you. I've got to do a live shot.
Well, you understand that part of it.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So I said, okay, we call the paramedic because something's not right. And so called the paramedics, and I vaguely remember them kind of carrying me down the stairs. And apparently when I got to the hospital, PSL, St. Luke's, by the way, great hospital, I had a pulmonary embolism and from the blood clot, and then I coded twice.
In real terms, what does that mean?
It means that blood clot went into my lungs and stopped that, and also caused these cardiac arrests. They brought me back to life. I was in ICU, in medical induced coma for about 2.5 weeks. And then after that, I was in the hospital for a lot longer than that, and along with a little bit of physical therapy from Spalding. It was about a 3-month ordeal. And so I've been laying on my back like for most of that. And so things atrophied. I had to sort of, I don't want to say relearn to walk, but kind of get that together and that strength back. It was an ordeal. If I had not had that call to the paramedics, I'd be dead. So I'm a lucky son of a bitch.
Well, I know.
And I'm appreciate being alive. Then one other thing, when I was in the hospital is when the Boulder shooting happened. And I'm laying in the bed and I'm watching this, and I look at it and I go, gosh, I'm glad I'm not there.
Well, see, I call that, and it's part of my life. In New York, there's a great story, and when they go from fire horses to Fort LaFrance or somebody starts building fire trucks.
Yeah.
So they have all these, I've told the story too many times, but they have all these old fire horses. And so some genius says, well, we'll make them pull garbage wagons, and everybody's a great idea. They hook all those horses up. Well, that's great until the smoke and the cinders and the bells are ringing and people are screaming. Those horses took off for the fire.
Yeah.
And that's us.
Yeah.
But the other part of that too, and I had heard all the stories that you were, going through a lot because how big is this business? About this big, right?
Yeah.
We all know everybody. So when I saw you on Saturday night, I thought those stories weren't true because you look great, and I know that you and Vicky, and that was like amazing too.
Yeah, and before that, obviously, as you mentioned, I'd lost my wife to cancer.
Yeah. Who I love. We should call her Ma Bell. So
yeah, Ma Bell.
Ma Bell.
Yeah, she made cookies for you.
Absolutely, took care of me. It was like she was a loving, kind woman.
Yeah, very great.
She was way smart too.
Yeah, super smart. Yeah, I always used to say that's a smart one of the relationship. So that's always going through that as an ordeal. Don't wish it upon anyone. Yeah. It's hard for the person that's going through it, and it's really hard also for their spouse. And it's just one of those things that happens. But in the same period, my father passed away, and that was a tough deal, and a lot of things happened all kind of at one time. I didn't really. For me, it was kind of like my escape was work. So. Working hard. I've always believed in a good work ethic, carried me through. And I'm also a person who's adaptive to change, never resisted change. I saw too many people lose their jobs who were resistant to change.
Absolutely.
That's the quickest way to go out the door is fight the new management or fight the,
How many times?
Give it a chance.
Listen to that guy, will you please?
Yeah, give it a chance.
Give him a moment.
And, if it doesn't work, they're going to be gone, not you.
Charlie Martin used to call those guys, the management teams, he used to call them the visitors. He did. Because like favorite radio show, Storied. We're in the Petroleum Club building. I'm doing 8 to midnight on K-How, and of course, the Hal and Charlie legendary morning show.
Right.
And they're always bringing in these, new owners and they would always have that moment. You go to the boardroom, and the engineers are wearing their double knit suits.
Yeah.
And here comes a couple of guys out of New York, and they go, "First of all, we want you to know there's not going to be any changes made."
First, there's going to be changes.
No, of course it does.
I got a great corporate story. When I was in San Francisco, we were a non-union station, and so occasionally when we wanted stuff, we would threaten to go union.
Yeah.
So there was this guy named Chuck Browning. We called him the Chucker, and the Chucker would get on the intercom and go, "After a meeting, 4:00," and. So we had some younger people who were, kids who were assistants and stuff, and they were really getting screwed on their pay. So we're doing this threat to be union. None of us wanted to be union, but we would threaten it. So the station had been sold from the original owner, and his new owner just freaked. So they bring in all these guys in 3-piece suits, and we're sitting in the boardroom, and they're going to tell us why we shouldn't go union. Our morning guy at the time was a guy named Bobby Ocean, still around.
Oh yeah.
Bobby has a duffel bag. He reaches into the duffel bag, and he pulls out a .357 Magnum, spins it on the table, and looks at this guy in his suit and goes, "We're tired of your bullshit." End of meeting. And everyone got what we wanted.
It's a story.
I don't know if it was loaded or unloaded. I don't know. But I mean, it's like
kind of collect radio
stories. Yeah, that's a good one, right?
That's a really good one.
I've got plenty of them.
Oh, well, that's why I'm trying to collect everybody and put them in a room, because somebody in the future is going to go, "Let's take a look at this." But it was a station that I was familiar with, and I knew everybody, and they were always threatening to go union. So they would have these off-site secret meetings. What they didn't know was that the owner had a rat. I'm serious.
I'm sure.
And whoever stood up and was the most vocal about the owner, whose name will not be they'd get fired. And they go, "Well, how did they know that Jim Bob stood up and went, what a..." And they went on to, so finally they figured out who the rat was. And I worked at another radio station. The guy ratted everybody. He went, and he's a big-time radio executive today. He would just go in and rat people out. And I thought, man, how did these guys grow up?
Yeah, I worked for this owner, as I mentioned, in San Francisco, a guy named Jim Gabbert, still alive, still kicking, owns a TV station there now, got out of radio. Jim still does live on this 90-foot yacht in Sausalito.
There you go.
The boat's name is the Defiance.
All right.
And which he bought, I think it's from either Ehrlichman or Haldeman. I can't remember which, but it's an
On his way to federal prison.
It's an ocean-going yacht, and so every year at the station we would have the yacht party, and we'd go on this yacht and we'd tool around the bay and everything like that. So this one yacht party, everybody in the station knows that the morning guy is going to get fired.
Yeah.
All right. He's on the boat, so of course nobody is near him, right? You don't want to be near the
No,
guy
contaminated,
who's going to
yeah.
get
Well, I
fired,
saw
right?
that too, yeah.
He figures it out. He's stuck on a boat in the bay.
Yeah. And he
That's
knows.
ugly. And Jim was the kind of guy who just kind of got off on that kind of stuff. But he had other really great qualities. I had more fun working for that guy than anybody I ever worked with.
John Lego.
But that was a true story. That was like
John,
horrible, but
Captain
true.
Showbiz, legendary programmer. And I was in awe of the guy. He was about 6'6", and he became the consultant for Bob Lee and myself on KLAK, which is, like, I learned about, skimmer tapes. And
Yeah.
So he had been canned off of KHOW, and he had run KHOW up.
Yeah.
So I used to call him the Big Train. I said, Big Train. I said, how did they find out you were fired? He said, well, and they all grew up in Iowa.
That's right.
No, he's driving home from Des Moines, Hal's from Des Moines, Charlie's from Des Moines, and he stopped in some place for breakfast, like crossover Wyoming, and pulls over, opens the Rocky Mountain News, and it says Lego fired and killed.
Oh.
And he fired right in the paper.
I've heard stories of known guys who they're driving into work and they go coming up next and it's not them.
It's not them.
That's happened.
Or the format change.
Yeah. Speaking of which, on KGO radio in San Francisco, 3 decades strong, top station, and many, many years top biller in all of America. They just turned it off, and now it's a sports gambling station. It was bought about 10 years ago by Cumulus Broadcasting. They got greedy. They blew out. They had really great talent there. They blew out all those guys and thought they could run it on the cheap. Then they thought they could run a news format and compete against KCBS, which already owned that format. And this is slow death. And then they finally just, put the stake in it. But they took a property that was literally, it owned the airwaves there. Now it had problems. Like this is one of the things I think in terms of radio, AM radio stations. There's a lot of cars now you buy don't even have an AM radio.
They're not making them with AM.
Yeah, and they just don't. So that's one thing that's hurting AM radio. So you got to pair it up with an FM to be successful. And they never did that. And they took a property that even if it atrophied a little bit and they kept it, would have made money, and they killed it.
I'm a believer in content is king.
Yeah, of course it is.
And if you're good, they'll find you.
Yeah.
But what's happened to the business is, and there still are the Willie B's and those guys who I just admire. And think they're still Dave Logan,
Yeah.
But content's king. If you ain't any good, it's going to show quicker now than it did in those days.
Yeah. When we were J-Corps, the prevailing message we had is what comes out of the speaker is what counts the most.
That's right. Absolutely.
And that revenue and everything else will follow.
That's right.
Right? And it was a really successful formula. That formula now with consolidation, it's like you're not always playing to be number one. And so it changes that attitude.
Jerry Bell, after all of these years and everything that you've been through, is there a lesson that you go, okay, listen, that you want to tell somebody?
Whew. You know what, I always looked at anything that I did like an artwork. And so no matter the smallest thing that I did, like if I was doing a report, like just a little short report, the way most people do it, I do a couple lines, sound by a couple lines out.
Open, close.
I'd like to see how many different pieces of sound I could shove into that 30 seconds and make it sing. The other part of it was, the biggest thing I learned is in the most successful pieces that were compelling were making who I was talking to the star, not me. And what I see now, we were talking about talk radio. Talk radio's got a lot of God complex people on the air who think that they own the truth, and
it's frightening.
No one owns the truth.
It's frightening.
You've got to look for it in many different ways, You got to try your best. But what happens is, and this is what I think is happening to talk radio. We're talking to Alan Berg. What did Alan Berg say? Talk radio is the last neighborhood in town. And I would tell you, no, it's not. It's not anymore. Yeah. It's a lot of people talk. A lot of talk hosts take very few calls.
Or don't take calls.
Rush didn't hardly ever take calls.
If he did, they were very well screened.
Yeah, and so it's not a conversation. It's in many places it's a lecture, and it's the same thing as infiltrated cable televisions and everything. And where I go in there and go like, gee, I don't want to hear you going on for a half hour. You're boring me to death.
We're tribal, but with all the selections, including the phone selections, people tune out. And what's happened now is we tape this. Every AM radio station in Denver is just simply a Republican candidate outlet. And I've heard Republican candidates on morning shows and on midday shows and afternoon shows. Really, why don't we break away? Because we would have never done that. As a program director, you'd have come in, smacked somebody back in the head and said, come on.
Yeah, and it narrows who you're talking to.
Oh, absolutely.
And so what you have is an attrition of ratings. But, I would say this. There was a period in talk radio where the conservative talk radio was super needed. There wasn't really an outlet for conservatives.
Mike Rosen
and talk radio filled that void and filled it very well. Then along comes Fox News, and then now there's a gazillion other places
like
you can go and get
else, this is a business of, if you do successfully, like the Bill Cosby Show, a successful, upper middle class or upper class African American family. Next season, there's 5 of those shows.
Yeah.
And so.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the hiring that goes on in talk radio, even today, there's a feeling by people in the upper echelons that only a conservative person can be a successful talk host. And so that's what you get because that's what they've seen. And it's the same kind of thing. No one's willing to break ground. Now, in KHOW for a little while, we went with the slogan, not left or right, right or wrong. And we really tried to break that. And, when I left programming that, it was at a 3 share. It hasn't seen a 3 share forever. But, yeah, I would agree. I mean, to me, it's kind of like, if you're going to have those candidates on, and even if you're conservative and you agree with them, you still should press them and have, and see if they have answers and things. But so many of these things, and this I think happened to Rush Limbaugh. Rush Limbaugh in his earlier incarnation was a conservative, and he wasn't and then he got, to the point where he was playing golf with people, and he got to be sort of in this insider Republican thing. By the way, I'm a big, huge fan of parts of Rush. Rush, I always used to use this lesson. He talked about doing talk radio. He says, always go into your show with the idea that the phones aren't going to work and you have to do 3 hours.
I used to tell people, you take a towel, cover the phones, now do a radio show.
Yeah.
But those are...
A lot of people get seduced by whether the lines are lighting up.
We talked about somebody that we knew that would do
that. Well, it's like you could put a psychic on.
There it is.
And the lines will light up.
And they'll tell you.
But what's boring? No. Listening to other people's fortunes.
I'm looking at the clock. 11:12:09. Oh, wait a minute. They'd stop you and say, do you have a health issue? Like that. Oh, yeah, I do. They're shilling, right?
Yeah.
And I went, and the person we both love very much who says, my lines are full. And I said, you're smoking pot and taking all-night phone calls. That's what you're doing. And that's an easy one.
Yeah.
I love you. This was absolutely wonderful. Jerry Bell, of course. So you're the lion winner now. You've got a great relationship. What are you doing for anything?
I volunteer at History Colorado. It's a really great museum. If you haven't been there, go, because it is really, really well done. We're getting ready at History Colorado in late November to do a really deep dive on the Sand Creek Massacre.
Let me know. We'll put them on.
We'll
bring them in here.
Yeah, that'll be. I'm reading a book now that's based on a report that was done for the Methodist Church about the Sand Creek Massacre, because Governor Evans and Chivington were Methodists. In fact, Chivington was a Methodist minister.
Right.
And so they commissioned this report into Sand Creek and wanted to know what their involvement was. And it's a really interesting read. I like to read. When I was working, I didn't read as much as I would like to. I'd like to do more reading. But, you know, I'm open to doing something. I'm not against going back to work if it's the right thing, and I can do something that's, you know, more off the beaten path or a different path than what's out there. But honestly, I don't know if it's there.
We have a lot of people that came out of that Saturday night experience when Alan gets inducted. This is round one. I got 4 other people in the pipe that want to come in and do the show. And these are radio legends, and it's all going to get away. But next week, our shoot is the one and only Brother Jeff. Brother Jeff will be right here and do it.
Great.
So many guys back in the pipe. Mark Crowley, thank you. And of course, Kelly Michaels and Brian Taylor, thank you. The shoot continues. So next time we're together, next week this time, Brother Jeff. Take care of yourselves, and thanks for watching this one.